Phillips, and I'm an Associate Director of Alumni Relations and Advancement Programming, and a proud member of the class of 1987. Today, we conclude our series of all things Celtic, and we'll hear a presentation on modern Celtic history and politics entitled The Black and the Green, What Does It Mean? Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell. On behalf of our alumni relations team, I want to thank the many people who have offered expertise or suggested the topic for our webinars. And I would encourage you to contact the Office of Alumni Relations if you have suggestions for future programs. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Father Jerome Day. Father Jerome Joseph Day is a member of the Benedictine community. He teaches English and communication at St. Anselm College. His work includes journalism, political rhetoric, and discourse analysis. Since 2002, he's also served as pastor of St. Raphael Parish in Manchester. Father Jerome was a native of North Adams, Massachusetts, and a 1975 graduate of St. Anselm College with a degree in English. He holds master's degrees in Anglo-Irish Studies from University College Dublin, Irish Theatre from Trinity College Dublin, and Dogmatic Theology from St. John's Seminary in Boston. In 2001, he earned his doctoral degree from McGill University in Montreal. He is a member of many academic and learned societies and continues to teach, research, and publish on the rhetoric and discourse of the Irish famine and US elections. Today's webinar is being recorded and we posted to the college's website. There is a Q&A button on your screen. Please feel free to submit questions. So now I'll turn it over to Father Jerome to introduce us to Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell. Father Jerome, thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Bennett. It's good to be with you again. This is the third one I think I've done. I think I've probably overstayed my welcome. I will give you all a rest for a while anyway, but I must say I've enjoyed doing them very much. This afternoon's
for joining us.
Again?
Thank you, Jerome, for joining us.
Oh, no, you're very welcome. This afternoon's discussion has to do with two great figures, one from America and one from Ireland. And we don't usually think of the great Frederick Douglass in connection with Ireland, and we don't usually think of the great Daniel O'Connell, the liberator in Ireland, in connection with Black America or even with America in general. And yet the two of them came together in 1845 and they saw each other periodically. And the impact on both of them was profound. I think Frederick Douglass was only about 27 years old at the time he met up with O'Connell. And O'Connell was in only a few years from his death. He would die in 1847. But it made a huge difference, I think, for both of them. And the consequences have turned out to be very good, I think, for both men and for both countries. So if we could get started, thanks very much, Patrice, for your help, as well as Father Bennett's in getting this organized. And if you wanted to start clicking on the slideshow, I can begin talking about it, okay? So we called it the black and the green, and what does that mean? Well, there's the two figures. Douglass obviously looking fairly serious on the left, and O'Connell looking a little plump and relatively happy. He was descended from the Catholic aristocracy of Ireland. The O'Connell family is well known and well established in Ireland and survived with some of their land and status intact during the long years of British occupation. But in any event, he had to deal with it, and he dealt with it quite successfully. But as I said, they met in 1845. So next one, click. So the story of Frederick Douglass is where we might begin. And Frederick Douglass is nothing if not a man who knew how to turn a phrase. He turned his phrases always for the freedom of African Americans and really for anyone who was downtrodden. He was in favor of voting rights for women, and certainly the abolition of slavery is one of the great abolitionists. And he had some real sympathy for the immigrants coming to the United States. And there's one of his quotes: "Those who profess to favor freedom yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground." Now, notice he didn't say violence, he said agitation. And in other words, that we have to put our foot to the floor and our foot to the pedal to make our hopes, our aspirations for freedom and human rights clear, visible, and to show the support for them. Next. Now, O'Connell's goals were very analogous and yet rather different from Douglass. O'Connell wanted to have Catholic emancipation. It's worth remembering that more than 80, even 90% of the Irish population in his time were Roman Catholics. They had been discriminated against legally through various laws enacted by the King and by the British Parliament. And he wanted that emancipation. And he was able to achieve it, I believe, in 1829. So it was an important moment. And it led to Catholics being allowed to vote and Catholics being allowed to run for office. And he himself was able to enter into the British Parliament as a MP for Ireland. Another one of his goals was the repeal of the 1800 Act of Union. In 1801, both England and Scotland, which already had been united a century earlier, were united to Ireland with a single parliament. It meant that Ireland lost her own parliament and control over her own affairs. So the third goal that O'Connell had was an independent Kingdom of Ireland under the British Crown, but nonetheless independent with its own parliament. There was eventually that was worked out to be a kind of compromise in later years for home rule. And it eventually came to fruition with the establishment of the Irish Free State in roughly in 1920, 1921, so we're observing a century of that. And O'Connell also had fought in the British Parliament for the abolition of slavery in the United Kingdom, so all three major countries as well as Wales, and throughout the British Empire. And that was achieved. He was one of several people pushing for that. So he's well aware of the issue of slavery. He wanted it ended and certainly didn't want it in Ireland, didn't want it in any part of the British Empire. So those were his three goals. Next. Oh, here's a picture of Douglass as a young lad. He was born a slave in Maryland, I believe. Some historians have argued he was of mixed race. I don't know that we have any real proof of that, but anyway, has been argued that he was. And he had a skill that very few slaves on plantations were able to have, and that was the ability to read. And the women in the big house, the mistress of the plantation, taught him how to read, and it unlocked for him his imagination, and he could see the possibility of freedom. And it's obviously something that every man and woman is meant to have. Next. You see some examples from a child's book. On the right, you see he's clearly doing the work of a slave and under supervision, but also that same mistress of the house would teach him how to read, and it would be an invaluable gift that he got. Next. Same book. There's Frederick and one of the children of the plantation reading together, and it looks like the master of the plantation, which is called Wye Hill, I think, or Wye Hall, is not entirely pleased that his wife has been teaching one of the slaves to read. Next. No more slave work on the plantation. Then the leader, the head of the plantation, probably just saying goodnight to him or goodbye to him for something, but he managed to escape as a fairly young man, a young lad actually, and he made his way to Baltimore and then to the north, which is what, of course, many slaves tried to do. Not all of them very successful, but many did get north. Next. Wye House, yeah, that's the plantation where he served, I believe. And next. So, by the way, Maryland was a slave state, I believe, but it did not secede from the Union. So those are the dates for Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895. So rather long and fruitful life. He is best known for the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is a slave narrative. It tells the story of his birth, his experience, and it became one of the great texts in the abolitionist movement. Next. There's another quote. He has lots of great quotes. I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity. Next. There's another one. Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. So he acquired knowledge, and he certainly had no interest in ever returning to slavery. However, you remember that in the United States, the famous and infamous, really, Dred Scott decision did allow the free states, or required them to, if somebody got picked up, to be brought back to the slave states or from which they had escaped. Next. There's another one, goes back to his business of agitation. I prayed for freedom for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. In other words, one has to take control and be responsible for oneself. He was a very strong believer of that. Next. It's a little bit longer, but it's worth listening to. I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes. Were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. For of all the slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I've ever found them to be the meanest and basest, the most cruel and cowardly of all others. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason, but for the most deceitful one, for calling the religion of this land Christianity. So he has some harsh words for Christian slaveholders. And we have to acknowledge that there were even members of the church, even some religious orders, that had slaves in the South. Many of them are making reparations even now. The Jesuits had some slaves and are considering that right now. Next. Another comment from him: where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. That's a very telling argument, one that should have made any slaveholders in the United States think twice about the practice. Next. Still another one. The lesson taught at this point by human experience is simply this: that the man who will get up and will be helped up, and the man who will not get up will be allowed to stay down. Personal independence is a virtue, and it is the soul out of which comes the sturdiest manhood. But there can be no independence without a large share of self-dependence, and this virtue cannot be bestowed. It must be developed from within. Important lesson for us all. Next. There's an interesting question. What to the slave is the 4th of July? In 1852, that was a famous quote from a very famous speech that Douglass made. And of course, we can see how a slave would be unable to appreciate and quite unwilling to appreciate the values that most of us associate with the 4th of July. Next. Douglass was married twice over the course of his life. His first wife, a Black woman, Anna Murray Douglass, and then his second wife, a white woman, Helen Pitts Douglass, on the right. There were laws in some of the southern states against interracial marriage, but I believe they were married in New York and lived in Rochester, New York. So I believe they escaped that particular injunction. Next. This is Douglas's home in Washington for a period of time. It's now under public control and is available to be visited. Next. And this is his home called Cedar Hill. It's also in Washington, but is on the outskirts and is in a more countrified or rural setting. But that too is open and available for visiting. Both of them centers for exhibitions and information about Frederick Douglass. Next. There are two pictures of Douglass as a young man. Very impressive figure. Next. A little bit middle-aged. And then next. There's a photograph of, or not photograph, a drawing of him with one of the large gatherings that he had. And by the way, I think he may have acquired some of the sense of these rallies from Daniel O'Connell, who was using them very early on in his own efforts for Catholic emancipation. Next. And there is Douglass as an older man. Next, by the time he got up to Rochester, he was working as the editor of the North Star newspaper, and he used his newspaper and his journalism to advance the cause of slaves and then of freed blacks for many years. There's the thing on the left is a quarter, a dollar, a coin, and on the right there is a 25-cent stamp that was issued a while back. Next. Douglass had 4 children, Charles, Louis, Frederick, and Rosetta, depicted there, all of whom had made their own mark and their own contribution. Next. These are all descendants of Frederick Douglass, and last year, National Public Radio had them all deliver parts of their great-great-grandfather's famous 4th of July speech. Next. Here we come to Daniel O'Connell, and O'Connell lived as an older man. He lived from 1775, just as the American Revolution was beginning to think about taking place, and to 1847. And those of you who know something about Irish history will know that in Ireland, that's called Black 47, not just because it was the year that O'Connell died, but because it was the worst year of the 7 years of the famine. The famine, the Great Irish Famine, or in Irish, An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, began in 1845, and it continued up until 1852. There had been periodic regional small famines, but this was a national famine, and it was a devastating blight. And unfortunately, their greatest legislator, their greatest hero up until that time, often called the uncrowned king of Ireland, the same title that would be given to Daniel Stewart Parnell another 50 years later, was bestowed by popular acclaim on Daniel O'Connell. Next. There's 2 more pictures of him. You can see over in the corner on the left, down in the corner of that, there's a little bit of a picture of his family home in County Kerry. It was called Derrynane, and he wasn't born there. He was born in County Kerry. The ruins are still available to visit, but he established that as his kind of country seat. He had a home in Dublin as well. I'll pay attention to that cloak that you see there. That's an interesting thing. We'll see a little bit more about that in a bit. Next. Derrynane is again the home of Daniel O'Connell. They have even a chapel, you'll see that on the right. And the people there, that's a meeting of the Irish cabinet. For whatever reason, they wanted to go down to Kerry to have the meeting. And it's certainly a very appropriate place for Irish government officials to hang out. It's a beautiful place. I'm sorry to say I have not visited that, but if I ever get myself back to Ireland, it will be on my list of places that I'd love to see. Next. There's a 19th century depiction of it. You see the mountains and the inlet of the sea around Derrynane. Next. And there is the actual site The mountains are lovely. You can see right where the inlet comes. It's to the right, and you see that white dot underneath the mountain is the home. So very beautiful place, beautiful beach, and kind of a place where a man could think himself a king. And Daniel O'Connell would bow his neck to no earthly king and no foreign potentate. Next. There's some interior shots, the central hall and the stairway, a bust of O'Connell in the window. Next. There's the interior of the house. Those are obviously newer carpets, the Celtic design. Next. The dining room. You often wonder how many people sat around. That's not the dining room. That's the same room with different wallpaper and a different carpet. That's the drawing room. Next. There's the dining room. How many people sat around that table discussing the future of Ireland. Next. That's his study. Next. That's the chapel. The church gave him permission to have a chapel, and a priest would come and say mass for him and for his family and for staff. He and his wife they had quite a few children. I want to say 9, maybe. Not all survived, but that's what they had. Next. There he is doing some of his rousing the crowd. So he too was a man who had no problem agitating for change, agitating for human rights, the right to practice one's religion, the right to be free of slavery. These are basic human rights. Next. And one of the techniques that O'Connell pioneered, it was certainly something that somebody like Mahatma Gandhi a century later in India would advocate, were what they called monster meetings. They were so large. There would be tens of thousands of people from Ireland would come and hear various speakers agitate and demand certain changes. And the bigger these meetings got, the more the British government paid attention. So they worked. Next. One of the broadsides that would be plastered over the walls of various buildings to attract people to the cause. Next. Because he was so prominent, various British magazines and newspapers would have, they had their fun with him. He was elected to be a member for County Clare, even though his family home was in Kerry. But you see, he gets told no admittance because of the religion of Rome. He was a Roman Catholic. So it was one of the things that motivated him to demand Catholic emancipation. Very strict laws. I mean, if you go back a century, and certainly if you go back 2 centuries, Catholics, particularly Catholic priests, would be executed for practicing their religion. One of the saints I may have mentioned in the first webinar was Saint Oliver Plunkett, who was the Archbishop of Armagh. He was drawn and quartered in London for his practice of the Catholic faith. Next. There's another meeting. I think that one's in Clifton in the Galway Mayo area. Large crowd. Notice he's got his cape on. Next. It's another one of the calls for gathering. He was calling for also the repeal of the Union. So that's the reference to the repeal. And they have you have Sir Robert Peel, who was a former British Prime Minister, acknowledging the fact that the people of Ireland demanded this. By the way, those of you who follow British politics will know that what Ireland was seeking then is what Scotland and Wales now have. Back in the time of Tony Blair, Parliament passed a kind of federal approach to British government, so that everybody sends delegates to Westminster, to the Parliament, but Scotland and Wales both have their own parliaments or assemblies, as well as Northern Ireland have it. And in fact, the strange thing is the only place that doesn't have their own local parliament is England. And there are people who are trying to get that to occur. So we'll see how it works out. But anyway, that's the situation. Next. He's having tea with some buddies, and he's interrupted by people who want to talk to him about the effort to repeal the Union. Next. Again, because of the fact that O'Connell was a little round, he was often mocked. And there is one that's talking really from the mid-1840s, and it says the real potato blight of Ireland is Daniel O'Connell, according to his political opponents. So he's made to look like a tuber, a potato, a couch potato, maybe the original couch potato. But he was very effective in Parliament. There he is, I believe, refusing to take the oath to the king in Parliament. And they eventually let the Catholic delegates did not have to swear allegiance to the king as the head of the church. So an interesting change. Next. That's the door to his home in Merrion Square in Dublin, one of the famous Georgian buildings, and that too is open to the public. And it would be here that Frederick Douglass met with O'Connell for the first time. Next. O'Connell was so well loved that in parades they would lift him up so he could be seen by the crowds, and he would come in sometimes to the monster meetings with this sort of chariot, which is set up like a throne, and they still have it. You can see over on the other side, on the right-hand side, on one of the seals on the side of the horse-drawn chariot is Hibernia, with symbols of Ireland. So the round stone tower that the monks built, the harp of Ireland, which remains the national symbol, and then Hibernia is prepared for battle, but is very peaceful right there, and an Irish wolfhound, another sign of the Irish experience. Next. Still another cartoon. One of the fears that people had in England was that Catholic emancipation would create papal control over a part of the country, and eventually it would seep into the whole of the country. And what they show is O'Connell and other Irish Catholics being subservient to the Pope, whereas behind him you see the king trying to get the Pope's attention. The Pope is paying no attention to him because the Pope is busy taking over the United Kingdom, which was, of course, all nonsense, but was nonetheless the fear. And we should note that the United States had that same fear, that the arrival of the Irish would bring in an increase in Romanism or papistry or popery, and Catholicism in this country would turn its adherents away from loyalty to the country. The concept of owing to God the things that are God's and to the state the things that belong to the state seem to be elusive to some of our fellow Americans and our British cousins. Next. And yet another one, one of the great places where O'Connell had one of his big meetings was the famous Hill of Tara. You remember when we spoke about St. Patrick, that Tara was where the High King resided in ancient times. Patrick went right there to achieve it. And they show the uncrowned king receiving the obeisance of various elements of the Irish people, some of whom seem to be already suffering from famine. I don't know if the cartoonist realizes the irony that he has shown. You'll see that underneath O'Connell's foot is placed a copy of the British Constitution, suggesting that O'Connell has no interest in the traditions of the British Isles. Next. There's a sign on one of the buildings in Cork, the city of Cork, that Frederick Douglass had been honored by the anti-slavery societies of Cork and the people of Cork. And the Irish people were generally quite supportive of efforts to eliminate slavery, both in the British Empire as well as in the United States and really anywhere that they could find it. Next. All right, so they finally meet, and there's a letter from O'Connell and Theobald Matthew, is the famous Father Matthew, both who was trying to bring about an end to alcohol abuse and promote temperance throughout the country. He saw that as very inimical. It's easy enough to understand why people who are oppressed, either economically or in terms of their very freedom, might turn to alcohol for relief, but it certainly doesn't do them any good. You'll notice at the bottom of the letter, it says it was signed by 60,000 other inhabitants of Ireland. So it's urging the Americans to end slavery and calling upon Irishmen and Irish women when they are there, if they emigrate, to treat what they call colored people, the people of color, as their equals. Next. Douglass is remembered in Rochester and in Maryland and in many, many places in the United States as a tremendous abolitionist, a great orator, a great advocate for the rights and freedoms of African Americans, our Black people, and saying that to our white people over and over again, that we need to understand the importance of that if we're going to have a whole and a healthy country. Very interesting figures. And of course, there are many academic programs named in honor of Douglass. I should also point out many people don't know that. I must say I was surprised to discover that toward the end of Douglass's life, he was the United States Consul General to the Republic of Haiti, which was a Black republic. It was the slaves in the French-controlled Haiti on the island of Hispaniola, shared with the Dominican Republic. They established the second republic in the Western Hemisphere and set it up. So he represented the United States there and did so for, I think, about 3 years. Next. Here are the monuments to Daniel O'Connell. 1882, Ireland comes out of the famine and is very strong now at this stage in land reform and moving toward home rule. And this quite significant monument is put up in the center of Dublin. You can see the size of it. There are people down at the bottom. Each of the four angels represents the four provinces of Ireland. Then there are historical figures around the middle, and O'Connell is up at the top. Unfortunately, the pigeons of Dublin think it's one of the best perches to have in the city. So it often, well, we just say Daniel O'Connell had to deal with a lot of it in his day, and he still has to deal with a lot of it. But he triumphed. And so we might go next. Each of the angels, as I said, represents a province. And this particular one, they also represent ways to achieve victory. And so this angel represents victory through strength and courage. And it's destroying a serpent. Must have been the only serpent that St. Patrick didn't drive out. And she is strangling the serpent with her hands as she holds the fasces, the symbol of authority and political power, in the other hand. But the other ones talk about victory through oratory and the arts, through rhetoric, and one other I've forgotten. I have to go back and look at that, but very powerful. I think it's a great place to meet people if you've got to meet somebody downtown in Dublin. And it is at the head of O'Connell Street, which is at the end of O'Connell Bridge, and it's the O'Connell Monument. In the photograph at the right with the very blue background, you'll see not a line, but a spire. That is called the Millennium Spire, was erected for 2000 in Dublin. And it's basically kind of a modern way of representing aspiration to the stars, to the skies. But sadly, it also suggests that Ireland was already beginning its very secular move, and the idea of putting up anything that would have a religious significance didn't seem to hold very much sway. But in any event, it's there. And it replaces, in some sense, although it's located somewhat farther back on the street, some people may remember the famous Nelson's Pillar, a very, very large column with a statue of Lord Nelson, the victory at Trafalgar commemorated. And of course, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom at that time. So hence the thing. The IRA very helpfully blew it up. I'm surprised that they didn't just knock the statue off and use the pillar, but anyway, what can you do? Next. There's a famous quote from Douglass, his time in Ireland: "Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man." That was a letter he sent home after his visit started. And if we have time, I'd like to read just a little bit of that to you, if I can find it. Yeah, so the letter is to William Lloyd Garrison, one of the great abolitionists, and it was written on New Year's Day, 1846. And Douglass writes, "My dear friend Garrison, I am now about to take leave of the Emerald Isle for Glasgow, Scotland. I've been here little more than 4 months. I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life. The warm and generous cooperation extended to me by the friends of my despised race, the prompt and liberal manner with which the press has rendered me its aid, the glorious enthusiasm with which thousands have flocked to hear the cruel wrongs of my downtrodden and long enslaved fellow countrymen portrayed, the deep sympathy for the slave and the strong abhorrence of the slaveholder everywhere evinced, the cordiality with which members and ministers of various religious bodies and of various shades of religious opinion have embraced me and lent me their aid, the kind hospitality constantly proffered to me by persons of the highest rank in society, the spirit of freedom that seems to animate all with whom I came in contact, and the entire absence of everything that looked like prejudice against me on account of the color of my skin, contrasted so strongly with my long and bitter experience in the United States that I look with wonder and amazement on the transition. 11 days and a half gone, and I have crossed 3,000 miles of the perilous deep ocean. Instead of a democratic government, I am under a monarchical government. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. So that's just an extract from a rather long letter, but it certainly gives us a sense of the appreciation that Frederick Douglass had for his Irish experience. His hope and his positive attitude toward Ireland is certainly gratifying, but perhaps it was a little bit clouded by the Irish mist. Next. And by the way, just you notice that cape that he has, that's a new monument, a relatively new one that has been put on. And what it is it's the same kind of cape that that Daniel O'Connell himself wore. And I have the feeling, I don't know where I read this or where I found this, that O'Connell actually gave him his cape. So I have to say I don't know that, but I would love to find out that detail because I think that that is the truth. But in any event, the mantle, so to speak, of rhetorical leadership for freedom passed from the soon to die Daniel O'Connell and his tremendous record in Ireland and his support for freedom everywhere to the now rising figure of Frederick Douglass and his tremendous achievement here in the United States. So the next one, please. And the next one. And I just give you two representations of the aspirations, the blue, pardon me, the green and the black. In the flag at the left, you'll see that's an African-American flag of unity and solidarity with the country, but also among themselves, and to recognize that they have work to achieve. And the Irish have a similar one with orange stripes and a green canton with stars. Sometimes you see shamrocks there. So different groups take the American stars and stripes of red, white, and blue, and they adapt it. But I think the important thing for all of us to remember is that we are Americans, and our various histories, important though they be, need to be directed toward the building up of a fair, just, and free, and a land of hope and opportunity for all our people, whatever their background and however long they may have been here. Next. And I just thought you might like to see some of the differences. So for the Blacks, for the African Americans, here for more than 400 years, and certainly 250 years of slavery, emancipation with Lincoln becomes the Jim Crow laws of discrimination, becomes the civil rights struggle of the 1960s. For many of the African American population, the middle class goal is rather elusive. It's very difficult to achieve. And we find that our middle class is getting thinner and thinner as we go through history. And also rather slow access to broad political influence and power. Certainly the election of Barack Obama and his 2 terms in office is a great sign of progress for African Americans, but is not entirely, it hasn't sealed the deal, so to speak. For the Irish, they had 100 years of struggle. We consider the 1840s as their arrival time. Of course, there were people here from the beginning and in some numbers, but the great numbers came in the 1840s with the famine. For a century, they too struggled against religious and ethnic discrimination. They had the advantage of coming and being relatively free, and they also had the English language, which many immigrant groups did not have. But the Irish faced quite extensive discrimination at the beginning, and that continued in some respects. If there's a group that gets made fun of more than the Irish, I don't know. In fact, I'll tell you, I remember the compact, the New Hampshire College and University Compact some years ago issued a call for a new program with regard to alcohol. And it wasn't a bad thing, it was a good thing, but they issued it on St. Patrick's Day. I understand why they might have done that, but there were more than a few Irish Americans in New Hampshire who found that to be quite offensive. So you still see things. For many Irish Americans, the middle class goal was realized, and they have had steady growth in political power. So, and the Irish have learned how to use it quite extensively. And I believe that Brother Biden is also an Irish American. Next. And then we might want to think about some areas where Blacks and Irish Americans, Black Americans or Irish Americans are both in contention and cooperation over the years. So voting rights and access. They have cooperated together on that, and they've also been hostile to each other in that. Jobs and promotions, always kind of the fight to the newest ones on the bottom of the ladder get kicked by the ones who are slightly up and above it. Housing opportunities, certainly another area of issues. And integrated education and busing. Those who remember the busing controversies in Boston will certainly remember Louise Day Hicks, and often very hostile to African Americans. So areas where we need to continue to work and develop ways to cooperate. Next. And that, Father Bennett, is the end of the slides, and it's a present to you, because that comes from the great city of Cleveland. And it is a group of an interracial group of people, presumably friends, who are celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And the question is, after the revelry runs off, how do we work together? How do we support each other? How do we stand in solidarity with each other as Americans who are striving in many real ways for much the same thing? And so we hope that the bon ami, the good times of St. Patrick's Day lift everybody up, but that they put us on the right path, not just in Cleveland, but across the country. And the examples, the stellar examples of Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell, whose paths crossed, certainly tell us that the Black and the green have a lot to offer each other. And you'd be interested to know maybe that there are lots of academic programs that turn to both of these men. There are, in Irish dance, we talked about that in the last one, there are several shows that have both African-American, Black, particularly in tap dance, and Irish step dancing mix. So cultural expressions as well as art programs. And a number of theater groups have explored the legacy of Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell. So lots of areas of cooperation and lots of room for hope. So with that, I wish everybody Benocti na Fela Padrig, the blessings of St. Patrick, and be with you all. It's a great month. And I want to thank Patrice and Father Bennett for the opportunity to share some time with you. I'm very happy to answer any questions if anybody has them. I don't know where we are in time, but whatever you think.
Jerome, in some of your slides, cartoons were used. Can you speak a little bit about the role of the cartoon as a political or rhetorical device and the impact and import of that media?
Yeah, it is a very powerful way of expressing views and attitudes. It attracts a lot of readers. The culture of memes that we have now on the internet would be a modern development of that same thing. And of course, you can get a punch in the nose if you show the cartoon to the wrong person. Most of those are from Punch, which was a very there was one I know from Harper's Weekly. They were publications in Britain and America that people who wanted to know what's going on in the world would read, and they were powerful. One of the problems, though, is that many cartoons, even to this day, rely on stereotypes, and in a certain sense, stereotypes help convey the humor, but they also can denigrate people. They can tear them down. So you have to be careful that cartoons do not pigeonhole people into, unacceptable categories and so forth. It's interesting to note that in some of the early American cartoons, both the Irish and the Blacks were often portrayed in simian terms. In other words, as apes, as monkeys. There's one, Ignatieff, one of the kind of philosophers and cultural observers, Michael Ignatieff, I think, is the one who has this book out. But I believe that's his book. It's called How the Irish Became White, because it was an indication that when they first arrived in this country, many Irish people were seen as simply white Blacks. That's a disrespectful attitude toward African Americans and disrespectful toward Irish Americans. But it was the way the dominant culture often portrayed them. So powerful tools. When I teach political communication as well as journalism, we always have a class or two on political cartoons. So there you go.
Thank you. One of our viewers offers a comment, and he or she is recommending Giant's Causeway, Frederick Douglass's Irish Odyssey and Making of an American Visionary by Tom Chaffin of the University of Virginia Press, published around 2014. It's about the 4 months that Douglass spent in Ireland, England, and Scotland. And our participant notes he or she, it's an anonymous attendee, found it an interesting read. So if anyone's interested.
I'm glad to hear that recommended. There are some books. There's another one by Christine Keneally, and I think it's I think it's called Douglass in Ireland, or something of that nature. And if we want, I can maybe put a little bibliography together, and you can send it out to the participants if we capture their emails or whatever.
Thank you. In our last for our last question for our session, black and the green, what does it mean? What's your final words on the meaning of the black and the green?
My,
What's our takeaway?
the takeaway is the dignity of people, the fact that people have often unique and interesting, very, very specific to them experiences. And yet underneath all of it, there is a basic and fundamental humanity. And that if we think about what people yearn for, they yearn for freedom, they yearn for dignity, they yearn for the expression of their rights, they yearn for the ability to be agents in their own life, to have some capacity to exert meaningful action in their own lives. And that crosses all categories, all times. And I think we can find lots of room for cooperation and support with Black Americans and with Irish Americans. And for both groups that have been here for quite a while, a reminder to us that there are still people coming to our country, still newcomers, many of them who also face discrimination and difficulties. We certainly see that for Hispanic Americans and for Asian Americans. And so the hand needs to be extended. And that would be the takeaway, I would hope.
Well, thank you very much, Father Jerome, for today's presentation, as well as for joining us for the last 3 weeks, walking us through a good deal of Celtic culture, spirituality, literature, artwork, architecture, and today's fascinating, I found it kind of a fascinating presentation on the black and the green. I did not know the connections between O'Connell and Douglass, but I think I've got a couple of new good books to use to understand that more deeply. So thank you very much for sharing your time and your preparation for these webinars, and for sharing your experience and your Celtic heritage with us. So thank you very much, Father Jerome.
My delight. Thank you very much, Father. Good luck to everybody, and thank you.
Thank you.